History is often taught as a sequence of dates and battles, a clean timeline of cause and effect. But if you look beneath the surface of the last 125 years of American warfare, you find a recurring pattern. We like to believe that the United States is a reluctant warrior, a nation that only picks up the sword when liberty is threatened or when it is attacked first. We hold to the ideal of self-defense. However, the reality of the 20th and 21st centuries tells a more complicated story. From the Atlantic Ocean in 1915 to the jungles of Vietnam and the deserts of Iraq, the road to war has frequently been paved with false pretenses. These are the moments when the government or specific interest groups needed a reason to fight, and when a clear justification didn't exist, they manufactured one. Sometimes it was a lie by omission. Sometimes it was a phantom attack. And sometimes it was a piece of theater so elaborate it was written by a public relations firm.
We must stop the terror. I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive. All right, we need another.
Today, we are going to deconstruct 4 specific turning points between 1900 and the present day. We will examine the innocent passenger ship of World War I, the ghost attack of Vietnam, the teenage witness of the Gulf War, and the invisible weapons of 2003.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq.
This is the history of how the truth is often the first casualty of war. Let's begin in the early 20th century. The year is 1915. Europe is consuming itself in the flames of the Great War. The United States, led by President Woodrow Wilson, is officially neutral. The American public wants nothing to do with the European slaughter. But there are powerful interests, banks and industrial manufacturers, who are quietly funding and supplying the Allied war effort. To get the American people on board, the pro-war faction needed a moral cause. They needed a crime that shocked the conscience. They founded on May 7, 1915, with the sinking of the RMS Lusitania. The British ocean liner was torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland, sinking in just 18 minutes. Nearly 1,200 people died, including 128 Americans. The narrative that exploded across American newspapers was simple and horrifying. A barbaric German enemy had attacked a purely civilian passenger ship. It was framed as an act of unprovoked murder against innocent tourists. This innocence became the rallying cry. It shifted the psychological weight of the nation and painted Germany as a monster. While the US didn't declare war immediately, this event was the emotional anchor that allowed Wilson to eventually lead the country into the trenches in 1917. But there was a lie at the heart of the Lusitania story. For decades, the British and American governments denied that the ship was a legitimate military target. They claimed it was just a ferry for people. In reality, the Lusitania was carrying over 4 million rounds of rifle ammunition and over 1,000 cases of shrapnel shells. It was effectively a blockade runner using human shields. The German embassy had even placed advertisements in New York newspapers warning Americans not to board the ship because it was sailing into a war zone and was considered a target. The U.S. State Department even blocked the publication of some of these warnings. The public was sold a story of neutral rights and civilian innocence, while the reality, that they were sitting on a floating ammunition dump, was suppressed to maintain a moral high ground for future intervention. Jump forward 50 years to the height of the Cold War. The location is Southeast Asia, 1964. The United States is supporting South Vietnam against the Communist North, but American involvement is technically limited to advisors. President Lyndon B. Johnson wanted to escalate the conflict to stop the spread of communism, but he needed a legal justification to send in a full-scale army. He needed Congress to sign a blank check. He found it in the Gulf of Tonkin. On August 2nd, the destroyer USS Maddox engaged with North Vietnamese torpedo boats. This was a real event, though the U.S. denied the Maddox was supporting South Vietnamese commando raids nearby at the time. However, the real false pretense happened 2 nights later, on August 4th. It was a pitch-black, stormy night. The Maddox and another destroyer, the Turner Joy, were on patrol when radar operators began seeing blips and sonar operators reported hearing torpedoes. In the confusion and stormy weather, the ships began zigzagging wildly, firing hundreds of shells into the darkness at targets they could not see. Reports flew back to Washington that the U.S. Navy was under a second, unprovoked attack. President Johnson went on national television and announced that renewed hostile actions required him to order a military response. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution almost unanimously, authorizing the president to take all necessary measures. This was the legal foundation for the Vietnam War. But the attack on August 4th never happened. James Stockdale, a Navy pilot flying directly over the ships that night, later stated there were no torpedo boats, only black water and American firepower shooting at phantom targets. In 2005, the NSA declassified its own internal history, admitting that the radar blips were likely weather effects or ghost echoes. Most importantly, the administration knew within days that the report was likely wrong. Yet they buried the doubt and used the ghost story to launch a war that would cost tens of thousands of American lives. As we move into the 1990s, the methods of manufacturing consent became even more sophisticated. Following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the American public was hesitant to intervene. To bridge the gap between policy and public opinion, the government didn't just rely on military intelligence, they relied on a public relations firm. In October 1990, a 15-year-old girl known only as Nayyirah gave a tearful testimony before a congressional caucus. She claimed she had seen Iraqi soldiers enter a Kuwaiti hospital, take babies out of incubators, and leave them to die on the cold floor. The incubator baby's story became the emotional center of the pro-war argument. President George H.W. Bush cited the story at least 6 times in public speeches. It provided the moral outrage necessary to authorize Operation Desert Storm. However, after the war, the truth came out. Nayyirah was not a volunteer. She was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the U.S. Her testimony had been coached and rehearsed by the PR firm Hill and Knowlton, who had been paid millions by the Kuwaiti government to drum up American support. Human rights investigators later found no evidence the incident ever occurred. The war was real, but the atrocity used to sell it was a scripted fiction. Finally, we arrive at the most infamous example of the modern era, the 2003 invasion of Iraq.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
This is what it's like on the receiving end.
Following the trauma of September 11th, the Bush administration aimed to remove Saddam Hussein. Since Iraq had no connection to the 9/11 attacks, the administration needed to prove that Saddam was an immediate existential threat. This led to the narrative of weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. For months, top officials spoke of mushroom clouds, aluminum tubes for nuclear centrifuges, and mobile biological weapons labs. The climax was Secretary of State Colin Powell's presentation to the United Nations, where he presented what he called irrefutable evidence of Iraq's chemical and biological programs. The US invaded, the regime fell, and the search for these weapons began. They found nothing. No nuclear program, no active chemical stockpiles, and no mobile labs. The intelligence had been fixed around the policy. The aluminum tubes were for conventional rockets, the nuclear documents were forgeries, and the story of the mobile labs came from a single source codenamed Curveball, a man whom German intelligence had explicitly warned the CIA was a fabricator and mentally unstable. When we look at this 125-year arc, the pattern is unmistakable. In each case, the Lusitania, the Tonkin Gulf, the Kuwaiti Incubators, and the Iraqi WMDs, the democratic process was short-circuited. The decision to go to war is supposed to be based on a clear-eyed assessment of the cost and the cause. But time and again, the public has been treated not as a body of citizens to be informed, but as an audience to be managed. These false pretenses serve to shut down debate and force a rally-round-the-flag effect before anyone has time to check the facts. He teaches us that skepticism is not the same as a lack of patriotism. When the drums of war begin to beat and the headlines scream of a provocation, that is exactly when we must ask the hardest questions. We must ask if we are seeing the whole truth or just another ghost on the radar. Because once the machinery of war is turned on, it is very hard to turn off, and the truth usually arrives only after the smoke has cleared.